Welcome back, everybody.
Hello.
And we're into part 3 today of our series on Israel.
We've got a little helper.
Yeah, welcome, Rex.
So,
Abraham
yeah.
and the covenant that God's made. Moses and the law. So today we're going to skip through the story of Joshua, the entrance into the promised land. Let's just stop there for a moment. Remember that not everyone who came out of Egypt made it into the promised land. Even though God had promised them a land, remember through Abraham and the covenant that he made to Abraham, he says your descendants will inherit this land. But the people who came out of Egypt, not many of them made it through. Who made it through? Can you remember? Caleb and Joshua. They were the only two. Why were they the only two that made it through into the promised land?
Because they were the bravest.
Not really brave, no.
Obedient?
Yeah, more. It was actually their faith.
Oh.
It was them. They were the two that believed God.
Yeah.
And so they were counted as faithful to the covenant.
Okay.
Remember Abraham?
Yeah.
Faithful to the covenant because of faith. So there's another thing that comes through, that the people that went with Joshua were the generation that believed God. And so they got to fulfill the covenant that God made. So anyway, we go through into the promised land. It's actually a very difficult time in the promised land for the people of Israel. They seem to have a difficult relationship with the people around them. There's idolatry from the people in the land already, and the people were serving other gods. So Israel decided, shall we just start to follow some of their gods as well? There's this intermixing of religions, and so God allowed them to be taken over. He took his hand off them, and they were taken over by other people. So it was a very difficult time. It was called the period of the Judges, where God raised up leaders to rescue them, but then soon enough after their rescue, they would go back to serving other gods. So ups and downs, the people of the promise, people of the curse. That's what the people of Israel were like. They seem to have the promises of God, but they're also part of the human race that were living under the curse.
So when it said Caleb, doesn't it say he was of a different spirit?
Yeah, that's right.
Meaning just more faithful.
Yeah, he was different from those around.
Okay.
Yeah,
so he didn't have
God.
highs and lows.
No, he didn't seem to have highs and lows.
Wow.
He was a man of faith, kept on believing God, even for the 40 years that they were in the wilderness.
Okay.
So, finally, they get to a period when they say, we want to be like the nations around them. We want to have a king. Which was a big slap in the face to God. Because up to that point they'd been led by, they call them the judges, but they were really people that were anointed by God to lead them. And the people of Israel, remember, they were a kingdom of priests. They were a people who could go to God, and a people who would represent God to the world. Now they said, no, we want to be like the rest of the nations, to have a king ruling over us, to tell us what to do. We don't want to go to God and have us representing God to the world. So God says, actually, they're rejecting me.
Well, yeah, because they're saying we don't want to do it your way. He's thinking you don't need a king.
Yeah, which is a classic thing. Do we do it God's way? Do we do it our way? That's one of the stories of the Old Testament. So, after a pretty dreadful start with King Saul, we get to probably the highlight of the whole period of the kings, King David. This man, God said, I found a man after my own heart. And we love the stories, don't we, of little David with his sling, taking down the big giants and all this. You know, this is a great a great story for your kids' Bible, I guess, and everybody knows that story.
And dancing naked. The kids love that story.
Ah, do they? I don't know that I've ever told my kids that story. So, but he's a king who is known to be ruling in righteousness. He was, in a sense, I think the Bible looks at him as another new Adam.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, here's a new start for the people of God, and there's a new ruler who's come on the scene, and a new family that will bring the people of God into the fullness of what God has promised them. Israel expanded their borders and kind of fulfilled this call of God to be a great nation that other nations would look to.
Go David.
He was the man. And he also wrote, you remember Psalm 8,
yeah,
which is all about how God has made mankind ruler over the animals, over the birds, and it's the new Adam. And we start to wonder as we're reading through, is this the man to lead the people of God into the fullness of God's covenant, of what they were always meant to be, this light to the world. He was a great guy, and God actually said to him at one point, I am going to establish your throne forever.
Yeah.
You will have someone reigning on the throne forever. It's like an amazing promise. And of course, we look at a lot down the line, and although he did have a number of generations, but the throne didn't last forever. But we understand that there was a prophetic promise there, that from the line of David, one would come. They called him the Anointed One, the Messiah, who would lead the people of God into all the fullness of what God had for them. And so there was this great expectation coming out from David.
Jumping to the next chapter now, you need to
yeah, I know.
stay in your blocks.
I am, but I want you to see how David was like a forerunner of Messiah.
Yeah.
He was one that was a model pointing to the one to come. So when we talk about David, the great giant slayer, we're not actually saying, oh, isn't it great that, if we believe God, then we can slay all our giants. We're looking at a model of one who would come and slay all the giants for us, who would be the great victor on our behalf, the Messiah. Okay, we've also got the Psalms.
He's the ultimate worshipper, isn't he,
Yeah.
Jesus?
Yeah, I guess so.
Like David's known for his worship.
Yeah.
And Jesus was the picture of what it's like to be a worshipper of the Father.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
You
so
can
the
put
Psalms.
that in your notes column.
Thank you.
from
Yeah,
me.
I'll do that. Thank you. I was just about to talk about the Psalms and how David was such a great worshipper, and at the end of his life, he's been a great king. He's done all these things, but he is known as the singer of songs. That was his legacy. And you read through the Psalms, I mean, what a rich source of prayer and worship. It's beautiful. The highs and the lows, the longings of a man's heart and their joy in God. It's very rich. But just as we're about to celebrate this new ruler who's fulfilling all the purposes of God, we find David.
Don't ruin it.
Sorry. He's a man.
Just leave it like that.
He gets tempted.
Oh, David.
And it's an interesting one. It's a great parallel with the story of the garden.
Yeah.
Where, they one hand they look at the fruit. Do you remember? Looked at it, considered it, saw that it was beautiful and desirable, and they reached out and took it. It is David on the rooftop, sees Bathsheba in the bath, saw, considered, saw it was desirable, took it. And it was part of a horrendous time in David's life and the family life. He never really recovered fully from that.
No.
There was a sense in which he lost something, and he became a man known for great things, great leadership, great military wisdom, but also with weaknesses. It was a shameful time. Okay, so out of that unfortunate period, there was grace, and God gave him a son called Solomon through Bathsheba, who was going to become the next king. And again, a great king, a king who at a young age said, I don't know the way to go, God. Please teach me your ways. Give me your wisdom so I should know how to choose right from wrong. It was like the garden again, and yet he chose God's way. He said, God, I want your wisdom, not my own. And he was known to be the wisest king. And people would come and see how great this kingdom is, how the people love to be here, and it's all a wonderful place. Queen of Sheba coming from miles away, you know. It's this picture of the nations coming to see the wisdom of God, which is a great picture. But unfortunately, you find that Solomon himself has problems with women. They lead him astray. He has too many wives, and they lead him astray. Actually, he was an oppressive ruler as well.
Was he?
Yeah, you find out that he's one of these guys that's making lots of people work in slavery, getting all his stuff built because of slave labour. There was an oppression about it, which we talk all the way back in about Nimrod and how he used oppression to build kingdoms, and we see the same thing coming in, and we think, there's the kingdom of God that's so wonderful, but right alongside it is the kingdom of man, and this oppression that comes through the kingdom of man. And he was such a wise guy, and he wrote all the wisdom literature, or some of it that we know about is the Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, that's right, yeah, all these books that have wisdom from God. I mean, it's worth just noting this. The Proverbs is like this amazing book of life tips. This is how life should be lived in the kingdom of God. Such wisdom. And when you read that, it all seems like, okay, this is really straightforward. Do this and life will be like this. It's all quite good. If we only had that, we'd think, okay, this is great wisdom, but for some reason it doesn't always work. And we've got Ecclesiastes that tells us actually life can be a little bit like that. Can be at times meaningless. It's like Proverbs is written from God's perspective. This is what life was like, meant to be like. Ecclesiastes is written, if you like, outside the garden, in the world that we live in now, where sometimes it is meaningless, sometimes it doesn't make sense. And so you even get the book of Job, which is again wisdom literature, where actually it makes no sense. Life makes no sense in the book of Job to Job himself, who was a righteous man who walked with God, and yet all these things came about. And
that's
so you get
useful way of explaining
this wisdom literature. Sometimes we think, it's just Proverbs, but it's not actually. The wisdom literature for the Jews is Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. It's like, okay, yeah, this is how life should be, but it's not always like that, and sometimes it really sucks. And yet in it, you find there's something of the faithfulness of God, even through the darkest times. So that's the wisdom literature that we attribute a lot of that to Solomon.
Okay.
That leads us into the kingdom splitting. It's a strange time in the story of Israel where Solomon's son.
This is where I always lose it in the Bible.
It is really complicated.
Sorry, I'm probably being too honest on this video, but this is where I kind of clock out and go, okay, I don't get it anymore.
No, it gets confusing because Solomon's son Rehoboam.
He goes north.
No, he stays south.
Rehoboam south.
So he starts to bring even greater oppression to the people, and they rebel.
Yes.
And so they go with Jeroboam into the north. Yeah. So the 10 tribes go north, 2 stay south, And that's where the kingdom splits. And the north is now called Israel, the south is called Judah. And there's a number of kings from the different areas. It really does go belly up from here, unfortunately, with a few exceptions. But really the period of the kings is one of oppression, of war. Really the kingdom of man has taken control. And there's very few glimpses really of the kingdom of God. Few highlights, but overall it's walking away from God and embracing other gods rather than the true God. And so we see the destruction that comes out of that. So life is pretty rough in these times. So we're going to finish there for this one, just to say eventually those kingdoms go into exile. The north goes into Assyria and pretty much is wiped out. They never return. The south actually goes to Babylon a couple of hundred years later, and they do return, and that's what we're going to talk about next time.
Yeah.
Okay.
They return back to where?
To Judah, and rebuilt Jerusalem.
With Nehemiah and all that
Yeah,
jazz.
that's right. We'll talk about that next time. Okay.
Can you hold my hand through the next bit? It's so confusing.
we're not going to do too much on that.
What's the main thing you need to know?
From this period?
Yeah.
From the period of the kings, we've got a model of a king who will come to restore the people of God, will lead them in righteousness and bring about all that God promised.
Yes.
He will free them from oppression and he will bring them into the fullness of their created mandate to rule the earth.
Okay.
That's what we get from the Book of Kings. Unfortunately, no human king was ever able to do it. We need someone that's not human. Well, that is human, but is divine as well.
We've exhausted our options.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, discussion question for this time is just to look more into this wisdom literature and say, how do we use the wisdom literature to pastor people in our modern day churches?
That's a good question.
Okay, that's one to discuss. Thanks a lot, guys.
Bye.
Talk to you again soon. Bye.